The hollowing. It started with a phone call. At 3:12 a.m., Sarah's phone vibrated on the nightstand, jolting her awake. She blinked at the screen, her heart already thudding in the quiet room. Unknown caller. With trepidation she answered. The line crackled with static, faint whispers swirling in the background like a bad signal caught in a storm. Then came a voice, low, trembling, and unmistakably human. "Sarah, it's me. Please help." Her stomach clenched. The voice belonged to her best friend, Mia. But something was wrong. The words sounded strained, as though Mia were speaking through clenched teeth or over great distance. "Mia?" Sarah's voice wavered. "Where are you?" No answer. Just heavy breathing and a faint, wet clicking sound like dripping water. Then the line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, the call log mocking her with its duration. 0:27. Mia had been missing for 3 weeks. The police had no leads. Her disappearance had been sudden, leaving behind nothing but a half-packed suitcase and a scattering of muddy footprints leading into the woods behind her house. But now she was alive. And she needed Sarah. The next morning, Sarah packed a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a hunting knife she'd found in her dad's old toolbox. Against every instinct screaming at her to leave it to the authorities, she drove to Mia's house. The property looked untouched since the search teams had combed through it. The broken flower pots by the porch, the screen door hanging at an odd angle, and the ominous woods that loomed beyond the backyard. The trees were unnaturally dense, their skeletal branches twisting together to form a canopy that swallowed the sunlight. Sarah's breath fogged as she approached the tree line, her boots crunching against brittle leaves. The air felt colder here, heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang. A smell that made her think of rust and decay. She hesitated at the edge, gripping the flashlight tightly. Then, with a deep breath, she plunged into the shadows. The forest was unervingly quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of her own breathing and the rhythmic crunch of her footsteps. The deeper she went, the more the trail seemed to change. The trees grew closer together, their trunks blackened and cracked as though scorched. Faint symbols were etched into the bark, strange geometric patterns that seemed to shift when she looked away. Then she saw it, a shoe. Mia's sneaker, half buried in the dirt, its laces frayed and stiff with mud. Sarah's heart leapt and she crouched to pick it up. That's when she noticed the footprints. They were small and bare, leading deeper into the woods. But something about them was wrong. The spacing was uneven, as if whoever made them had been stumbling or limping. And alongside the prints were long, parallel grooves, as if something had been dragged. Sarah's pulse quickened as she followed the trail. Each step felt like an act of defiance against the suffocating dread that pressed in from all sides. After what felt like hours, she stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its roof sagging under a layer of moss. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung ajar, revealing a gaping darkness within. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to turn back. But Mia's voice echoed in her mind, "Please help." She stepped inside. The air was damp and stifling, carrying the scent of mildew and something far fouler. The interior was sparse, with rotting furniture and a table piled high with melted candles. Strange symbols covered the walls, scrawled in what looked like ash and blood. Then she heard it, a faint sobbing coming from beneath her feet. Sarah dropped to her knees, running her hands over the floorboards until she found a loose plank. She pried it up, revealing a dark hole that descended into the earth. The sobbing grew louder, tinged with a strange, guttural resonance. "Mia?" Sarah called, her voice trembling. The sobbing stopped. Silence stretched, thick and unnatural. Then came a sound that froze Sarah's blood, a slow, deliberate laugh, echoing up from the darkness. Compelled by a mix of terror and determination, Sarah found a rope ladder anchored to the edge of the hole. She hesitated, then began to climb down. The air grew colder and more oppressive with every rung. The tunnel opened into a cavern, its walls slick with moisture and pulsating faintly as if alive. In the center of the room stood Mia, or what was left of her. Her body was emaciated, her skin pale and stretched tightly over her bones. Her head jerked unnaturally as she turned to face Sarah, her eyes black pits that seemed to swallow the dim light. Her mouth stretched into an inhuman grin, revealing teeth too sharp and too many. "Sarah," Mia rasped, her voice layered with something guttural and alien. "You came?" Sarah stumbled back, her flashlight trembling in her hands. "Mia, well, what happened to you?" Mia stepped closer, her movements jerky and insect-like. "It wanted me. It wants you too." From the shadows behind her, something massive stirred. A shape too large to comprehend, its form writhing and shifting like smoke and shadow. Eyes blinked open across its surface, glowing with an otherworldly light. And from its depths came a sound, a deep, resonant hum that burrowed into Sarah's mind, filling her with an overwhelming sense of despair. "Run," Mia whispered, her voice breaking. Before it, but it was too late. The entity surged forward, enveloping Mia and filling the cavern with its presence. Sarah screamed as the light from her flashlight flickered and died. When Sarah didn't return home, her disappearance made the evening news. The search parties combed the woods, but they found nothing. No cabin, no footprints, no trace of Sarah or Mia. Only a phone lying in the dirt at the edge of the forest, its screen cracked and flickering. The last recorded call was to Sarah's own number, placed at 3:12 a.m. And deep in the woods, the trees whispered with voices only the wind could hear. If you thought that was scary, wait until you hear this next story. The echoing silence. The letter arrived on a Monday, slipped under the door without a sound. Avery didn't notice it until she almost stepped on the crisp, cream-colored envelope, her name scrawled in an elegant hand. No return address, no stamp. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper. The words, written in a looping script, read, "You are cordially invited to Blackwood Manor. One night only. Sunset." There was no signature, no explanation. But Avery's heart skipped. She knew the place. Everyone in town did. Blackwood Manor sat on the outskirts, abandoned for decades. A sprawling, Gothic monstrosity that loomed over the surrounding woods like a sentinel. Stories of its dark past were as old as the town itself. Murders, disappearances, whispers of rituals held under blood moons. Avery thought of throwing the invitation away, but something about it clung to her, like a shadow at her back. She'd been in a haze since her brother, Caleb, vanished 6 months ago. He'd been seen last walking toward the woods near Blackwood Manor. She decided to go. The sun dipped below the horizon as Avery reached the edge of the forest. The road to Blackwood Manor was overgrown, the asphalt cracked and strangled by weeds. The woods pressed close on either side, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Her car headlights flickered as she approached the manor, and for a terrifying moment, they went out completely. Avery slammed on the brakes, gripping the wheel with white knuckles, her breath fogging the cold air. The lights flickered back on. The manor stood ahead, its silhouette etched against the twilight. The windows were dark, the towering spires and intricate ironwork casting jagged shadows. Avery parked at the base of the long staircase leading to the front door. The air felt different here, heavier, charged with something unnameable. She climbed the stairs, each creak of the wood echoing in the stillness. When she reached the door, it opened on its own. Inside, the house was impossibly pristine. Chandeliers dripped with crystal, their light refracting in dazzling patterns across the polished floor. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, though no one had lit it. Avery wasn't alone. A group of people stood in the grand foyer, their faces pale and tight with unease. She recognized a few of them from town, the florist, the librarian, a man who ran the diner. Others were strangers. Before she could speak, a tall man stepped forward. He was dressed in an immaculate black suit, his face gaunt but strikingly handsome, with eyes like pools of ink. His presence radiated authority, and when he spoke, it was with a voice that seemed to bypass the ears and settle directly in the mind. "Welcome, honored guests," he said. "You have been chosen." "Chosen for what?" Avery asked, her voice quivering. He smiled, revealing teeth that were unnaturally sharp. "For what lies beneath." Before anyone could object, the man gestured, and the floor beneath their feet shuddered. A spiral staircase emerged from the center of the room, descending into the earth. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of rot. "Please," the man said, gesturing for them to proceed. The group hesitated, but something unseen compelled them to move. Avery's legs carried her forward, her body no longer her own. One by one, they descended the stairs, their footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. The staircase led to a cavernous chamber carved from the bedrock. The walls were lined with shelves of books bound in cracked leather, their spines embossed with strange symbols. In the center of the room stood a circular dais, its surface inscribed with runes that pulsed faintly with a sickly green light. "This is where it begins," the man said, appearing behind them as if he'd materialized from the shadows. "What begins?" Avery demanded, her voice cracking. "The reunion," he replied. The man produced a small black box and placed it on the dais. When he opened it, the room was plunged into darkness, save for the pulsing runes, which now burned brighter. A sound filled the chamber, low, guttural, and alive, like a heartbeat magnified 1,000 times. The other guests began to tremble, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Avery's vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she saw shapes moving in the darkness. Long, sinuous forms, with too many limbs and eyes that glowed faintly. "It calls to those who belong," the man said. His voice was almost reverent. "To those it has touched." Avery felt a pull deep in her chest, as though an invisible thread were winding itself around her heart. The other guests began to scream, their bodies convulsing as they fell to the floor. Their forms shimmered, becoming translucent, and then they were gone, absorbed into the darkness. She staggered back, her mind reeling. "What did you do to them?" The man's expression remained calm. "They have returned to it. As will you." Avery's knees buckled as the pull intensified. Images flooded her mind, visions of Caleb wandering into these woods, standing before this very dais. She saw him disappear into the shadows, his face twisted in fear and awe. And she saw herself following the same path over and over in an endless loop. The man stepped closer, his voice soft now. "You were never meant to escape. None of you were. This place, it remembers, and it hungers." The shapes in the darkness began to close in, their glowing eyes fixed on Avery. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The last thing she saw was the man's face, impossibly serene as he whispered, "Welcome home." The next morning, the townspeople found Avery's car abandoned at the edge of the woods. The road to Blackwood Manor was gone, swallowed by the forest. And though they searched for weeks, no trace of Avery or the others was ever found. Sometimes late at night, those who lived near the woods swore they could hear faint whispers carried on the wind, a voice calling for help and another, darker voice answering from the depths. In case you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot and helps us continue bringing you more spine-chilling content. Let's move on to the second story, and trust me, this one will keep you up at night. The Forgotten Path. It began with a warning, a quiet, almost forgettable moment that later etched itself into Lucy's mind with crystalline clarity. She was at the counter of Harrington's diner, sipping lukewarm coffee as she waited for her order. The man next to her, a grizzled local she'd seen a dozen times but never spoken to, tapped her arm. His fingers were calloused, his nails blackened with dirt. "Stay off the North Trail," he said, his voice low and rough. "If you hear the bell, run." Lucy frowned, startled. "What?" The man's milky eyes fixed on hers. "You'll know it if you hear it. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just run." He turned away before she could respond, leaving her with a strange chill. She'd been hiking the North Trail for weeks, documenting the lush forests for her photography blog. Nothing about it seemed dangerous. No steep cliffs, no wild animals, just serene woods and a babbling creek. Still, the warning nagged at her. The following Saturday, Lucy packed her gear and set off for the North Trail. Despite the old man's words, she couldn't resist. The trail had become her sanctuary, a place where the world's noise faded into birdsong and rustling leaves. The morning was crisp, sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden shafts. She followed the familiar path, pausing occasionally to capture the way light danced on the moss-covered rocks. Then she heard it. A bell. Faint at first, like a distant wind chime. She stopped, turning her head toward the sound. It grew louder, resonating with an eerie, almost melodic quality that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. "Stay off the North Trail. If you hear the bell, run." Her chest tightened. It was probably a prank, she told herself. Maybe a camper with a bell or some odd animal call. But as the sound swelled, a deep unease settled over her. She decided to keep walking, her steps quickening as she tried to focus on the trail. But the bell followed, growing louder and closer. It was no longer melodic. The sound was jagged now, uneven, each ring scraping against her mind like nails on a chalkboard. Lucy broke into a jog. The trail grew darker, the canopy above thickening unnaturally fast. It felt as though the sunlight had been snuffed out. She glanced at her watch, 10:47 a.m., but the dim light made it feel like dusk. The bell's tone shifted again, deeper, slower. Each ring sent vibrations through her chest, as though the sound were a living thing, breathing against her skin. She stopped. The trail ahead looked different. The trees twisted, their trunks gnarled and blackened as though scorched. The air was heavier now, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Lucy turned to go back, but the trail behind her was gone. In its place was a wall of trees, their branches interwoven to form an impenetrable barrier. Panic clawed at her throat. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The only reply was the bell, now impossibly loud, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Lucy stumbled forward, her breath hitching. The trail twisted sharply, leading her to a clearing she didn't recognize. In the center stood a man. He was facing away from her, his posture unnaturally rigid. He wore tattered clothes that hung loosely from his gaunt frame. His head tilted slightly as though he were listening to something she couldn't hear. "Excuse me?" Lucy said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The man turned slowly. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and glassy, his lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He raised a hand and pointed past her. "The path," he said, his voice hollow. "You must follow the path." Lucy turned to where he was pointing, but there was nothing, just more trees. When she looked back, the man was gone. The bell's toll grew unbearable, reverberating through her skull. She ran, her legs aching as the forest closed in around her. The ground beneath her feet felt wrong, spongy and uneven, as though it were alive. She tripped, falling hard onto her hands and knees. The earth was cold and wet, clinging to her skin. As she pushed herself up, she noticed something half buried in the dirt, a photograph. It was old, the edges curled and faded. The image was of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, standing in front of a wooden sign that read, "North Trailhead, 1973. The man in the photo was the same one she'd just seen. Lucy's stomach churned. She dropped the photo and stumbled back, but the bell's toll grew louder, closer. She felt it behind her, a presence she couldn't see but knew was there. "Run," the man's voice echoed in her mind. She obeyed. The forest ended abruptly. Lucy found herself at the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath her feet. Below was a chasm, impossibly deep, filled with swirling mist. The bell rang from the depths, its sound now a distorted scream. A figure emerged from the mist, tall, faceless, its form shifting like smoke. It raised an elongated arm, beckoning her forward. Lucy shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No. The ground gave way. She fell, the figure's outstretched hand the last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her. When Lucy didn't return, search parties combed the North Trail for weeks. They found no trace of her, no footprints, no belongings, nothing. The only clue was a photograph pinned to a tree near the trailhead. It showed Lucy standing with the family from the old photo, her face pale and her smile forced. Beneath it, scrawled in a shaky hand, were the words, "The bell tolls for all." The next story will have you questioning everything. Let's get into it.